Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Kirsten, and together with my sister, Lynn, we created the Anti-Racist Table, which is a multi-dimensional platform aimed at educating Americans about anti-Blackness and the legacy that it has. Our goals are to rehumanize and to create empathy and to motivate action to dismantle systemic racism. As part of our work, we want to help people understand the way that anti-Blackness shows up for Black Americans, and healthcare is a big area where anti-Blackness is present and has a lot of negative implications and consequences for Black people. We're seeing it right now with COVID. We see it with maternal mortality and other health indicators, which our special guest tonight is going to talk about. But we also want people to recognize that, you know, in America, there's this narrative that many of these things that are happening to Black people, it's because there's something wrong with Black people, that Black people have done something to have health issues, and that's just simply not true. There's systemic racism, there's an American caste system, and there's anti-Blackness that has everything to do with the health and well-being of African Americans. And the more people who understand how we got to where we are and do their part to make it better, that's the way that we're going to turn things around and make sure that there's equity and justice in all areas of life, especially healthcare. So our challenge, we have a flagship 30-day challenge that we started to teach people about this information, to help them wrestle with the difficult truths and feelings that come up when you're talking about systemic racism, when you're talking about white supremacy, when you're talking about anti-Blackness, all of those things. And our challenge is a good way to introduce this material, whether it's at your workplace, at your school, in your community, in your own family. And the more people who are doing this work, the more people we have working towards making a just America. And if you're here tonight, you know, I think you're probably already doing this work. That's why you're here and you're interested in being on this side of things. So sharing this information with other people helps create allies and support, because this is hard, challenging work that you need support and you need a community doing it with you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lynn, who's my sister, who's going to do a land acknowledgement. Oh, Lynn, you're on mute. You're muted, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I had to mute myself because my dog was barking, but now he's not. So I would like to share a land acknowledgement with you that has been inspired by Ruth King, who is a Black mindfulness practitioner. So I would like to call on my ancestors to stand with me as I acknowledge the Native custodians of this land, which is Washington, D.C. That is the Anacostan Piscataway people. These are the people that have been named. They are also unnamed, known and unknown. They are past and present. We want to honor all the traditions and the traditional custodians of this region. We recognize that they still have a continued connection to this land, to this water, and to this community. We pay respects to the earth, whose generous resources sustain us on a daily basis. And we pay respect to all of the enslaved African people of this land who were brought here, who were held here and sold, and all of their descendants. And all of the people throughout the world who are in captivity now. We pay respect to their spiritual labor, and we pay respect to our ancestors whose unwise relationship to race and racism we have inherited. We pay respect to our teachers and our elders, past and present, and for the emerging young people and voices who are teaching us today. We honor this gathering, everyone here, and our guests for taking time and energy to be with us today. May we recognize that we share an aspiration for liberation, to be free in our heart, mind, and soul. Ashe. Here ends the land acknowledgement.
Now, I'd like to introduce our guest. Taiwo Alonge is a senior medical student and master's in public health student at Columbia University. He is an aspiring psychiatrist who will center his work around the health and well-being of Black children and adolescents, healthcare equality, justice, and policy. He recently published an article on anti-racism in medicine. Lynn will put that link in the chat, or one of us will. And he has more writing which can be found on his Medium blog. We'll also put a link in the chat for that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Taiwo. Thank you so much for being here. When we read your article, we were just very excited about the work that you're doing, and we're really honored that you're here tonight.
Thanks so much for having me, Lynn and Kirsten, and thanks everyone who's tuning in. In the spirit of the example set by Lynn and Kirsten, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement as well. So even though we're meeting virtually, I currently reside in Upper Manhattan in Washington Heights, and I just want to take this moment to acknowledge the Lenape people whose historic land was wrongfully taken from them. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the fact that the institution in which I'm receiving my medical education and public health education was built by the wrongful and forceful labor of enslaved African people. The legacy of settler colonialism still lives with us today, and if we ever hope to begin to right those wrongs, we must reckon with this history. By doing so, we must optimally position ourselves to dismantle racism, injustice, inequity, and all the other evils that intersect with this legacy and the current status of white supremacy today. Thank you.
Thank you. So, did we want to start with some questions for you, Taiwo, or did you want to kind of share?
Okay.
Kirsten, do you want to start with the questions for Taiwo? Or we can start with this one. We just wanted to kind of get a little bit of like historical context for racism in the medical field, just looking at some of the history that somehow is just kind of behind the veil that not many people know about. Can you tell us a little bit about this doctor here, Dr. Marion Sims, and any other information just about the kind of the roots of racism in the medical profession in America?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, given that, this is a talk about anti-racism and whatnot, I think in order to start that kind of work, we have to really, reckon with our history here in America with medicine and the institution of medicine. And, it goes really, really deep. From my understanding, from what I've learned, anti-Blackness and the foundation of modern medicine and public health really go hand in hand. Eugenics as a practice was supported and implemented by physicians and public health experts for years and years. And really a lot of those things still persist today and inform the displays. Before kind of getting into John Marion Sims, we can talk a little bit about Thomas Jefferson, who's one of the founding fathers. And, he wrote a document back way back when called the Notes on the State of Virginia, and he spoke extensively about the African race. In the many ways that kind of set the tone for the way medicine would look at Black people, using the social construct that is race to divide people. In his piece, he wrote about claims saying that Black people required less sleep, that they had inferior reasoning abilities, that grief and pain were very transient in them compared to white people, that Black people were beings of brief sensation rather than beings of reflection. You know, and eugenics, again, is a practice that began in the 20th century, like in the late 19th century. And again, like I said, so many physicians and public health experts have, you know, used that from back then. And even though we kind of have done away with those claims, they still inform things today. You know, again, looking at anti-Blackness in the nation's history and medicine, you know, J. Marion Sims is definitely a person that comes up quite a bit. You know, a few years ago, a monument of him went down in Central Park due to kind of a raise in consciousness about who he was. You know, and most people kind of refer to him as a father of modern gynecology. In the 1840s, he performed procedures on Black enslaved women without their consent or without anesthesia. You know, the idea was that Black people didn't feel pain, so therefore didn't need to be anesthetized for these procedures. You know, he writes about 3 women, Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy, who were enslaved Black women. And this picture is a picture of Anarcha, actually. And she was someone that had over 30 procedures done on her. You know, back then, there were issues with fistula, which are basically like improper connection between different organs. And J. Marion Sims was trying to figure out how to fix that. And he would, you know, do these experimental procedures on Black women. You know, with Anarcha, he did over 30 procedures that were unsuccessful. You know, lots of women died from these procedures due to infections, due to improper care. And these are kind of things that really exist within medicine. And, you know, this is only just one example. And these kind of practices are very persistent. You know, things like this inform other things in OB, obstetrics and gynecology. You know, there's a lot of talk about, you know, unconsented hysterectomies that occur, and those that used to occur back in the day, like the Mississippi appendectomy is what it was called in the South. You know, famous, you know, civil rights activists and leaders such as like Fannie Lou Hamer actually had these procedures, you know, and she would even claim that this procedure is kind of what radicalized her. She had it when she was 19. So, you know, and the sad part is these practices still exist today. You know, just recently there was a whole article about what was going on in some of these ICE detainment camps, where there were gynecologists who were removing organs from women who were in captivity. So, you know, these practices and like the kind of disvaluing of, you know, bodies of people of color and Black people is like pretty pervasive in medicine.
Yeah, the dehumanization of Black people began, it was, you know, very prevalent in the medicine, which is so shameful.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, this is a doctors take the Hippocratic Oath not to, isn't it, not to do harm? Yeah.
So, you know, when I started medical school, and a lot of medical schools do this, and even at graduations, and even sometimes in the beginning when people are starting residency, you recite the Hippocratic Oath. And it's interesting because I actually like teach a class with high schoolers who are interested in healthcare professions, and we like kind of discuss the Hippocratic Oath and like what's missing from it, like what was the context in which it was written, who were the people who wrote it, who were they thinking about? Were they thinking about other identities? So, you know, the Hippocratic Oath obviously like talks about, you know, do no harm, which is not actually a specific line in the Hippocratic Oath, but very much associated with it. And, you know, obviously a lot of harm is done to people of color and Black people. And it's, again, very prevalent, you know, with J. Marion Sims, with other things such as the Tuskegee experiments. You know, over 400 Black men were enrolled in this study in the 1930s all the way to the 1970s. And basically men who had syphilis were not given treatment. And, you know, they kind of just wanted to observe like what the long-term effects of syphilis were on people's bodies. And, you know, now everything we know about syphilis and like end-stage syphilis kind of comes from that study. You know, the really kind of messed up part about things is, you know, the cure to syphilis, which is penicillin, was discovered in the 1920s. So it's not like they didn't have it, they had it and they knew exactly how to treat it. But there was like, you know, willful neglect of people just for the purposes of experimentation and kind of advancing, you know, science and whatnot. And these men also kind of thought they were in a, you know, study that was going to help them, and, you know, it didn't, obviously. And, you know, when whistleblowers kind of, you know, removed the lid and told people what was going on, and the study ended. But, you know, these kind of histories really, really are deep in medicine. You know, I'm again, aspiring psychiatrist, and, you know, I think about schizophrenia, for example, and how, you know, in the 1970s, 1960s, when the diagnostic material kind of got updated and included words like hostility and aggression, you know, you saw a dramatic uptick in diagnosis of schizophrenia in Black people, particularly Black men. And, you know, there's a really great book by a gentleman, a psychiatrist named Jonathan Metzl, called Protest Psychosis, and how schizophrenia became a Black disease. And essentially, you know, he kind of posits that, you know, during the time of like civil rights and like kind of the struggle for liberation, you know, like physicians were kind of tagging Black people who had the audacity to want, you know, civil rights as psychotic and schizophrenic, and things like that were occurring. So, you know, these practices still exist today. And, you know, even to this day, you know, Black men and Black women are overrepresented in schizophrenia diagnosis, compared to white people who have the same exact symptoms. So, you know, if we really want to ever kind of begin anti-racist work, we have to really like wrestle and reckon with our history. Because when we don't do that, then we don't really address the root of our problems. You know, so many people are kind of afraid to kind of admit to wrongdoings because they feel like it somehow invalidates their practice and their position. But, you know, we have, if we're really committed to anti-racism, which so many people are, you know, now claiming to do, you know, post George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade and all these other people who were so tragically murdered, you know, we really need to kind of humbly come and reckon with our history, understand what's been going on to really kind of snuff out, you know, the evils that still exist today.
Yeah, that makes me think, do you feel like you got an anti-racist education in the medical school? Did you feel like they gave you a true narrative of some of these, you know, founding fathers of medicine? Or, you know, did you only get just kind of like the one-sided version of all the great things that someone like J. Marion Sims, you know, contributed to advance modern medicine?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of across the country, you know, medical schools kind of have something, there's like a large like committee that kind of structures like what medical schools are supposed to teach. You know, obviously some medical schools venture a little bit outside of that to provide additional teaching. So like in my school, definitely got some, you know, very basic kind of understandings of like, you know, racism in medicine and some of the history of it, but not in a really deeper, profound way. I think a lot of that kind of came on my own, you know, just my own general interest in these kind of issues, you know, really just always wanting to explore a little bit deeper, doing my own reading. You know, there's fantastic books like, you know, Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington, you know, a really great book called The Fatal Invention by Dorothy Roberts. These are really great books that touch on these things. There's lots of good curriculums on this as well, that I kind of like did the work on my own to figure out. And also I've had like some really great mentors and educators who kind of were interested in these things and would suggest this, and, you know, classmates and friends who were also interested in this. But as far as like medical education goes, information on like anti-Blackness in the profession, in the institution of medicine, is like pretty scarce. And, you know, again, you kind of really learn, you know, in a lot of ways, you know, one of the most problematic parts about medicine is like this idea that like race rather than racism is like a social determinant of health. You know, this idea that, you know, if you are Black, that means that you are going to have like worse outcomes giving birth to a child, as opposed to saying like racism is the reason why Black women are facing increased morbidity and mortality during childbirth, right? And it's like that kind of narrative that, you know, in medical school, and there's so much information, and when you take all these tests as well, you know, sometimes question stems will say like, oh, this patient is a Black patient, and like immediately you can start thinking about like answers to the question. And like when you kind of, you know, put a high priority in that kind of, you know, testing and trying to be good at medical school and get good test scores, it really, really, you know, can let problematic ideas about race in medicine persist. And, you know, I think that kind of needs to be changed as well. And I know that lots of like testing bodies are trying to figure out how to really reconstruct and deconstruct that, because, you know, that kind of reasoning and logic just really incentivizes you to learn medicine in a very superficial way when it comes to race, which is like wildly problematic, especially when we're talking about people's lives.
So if you say something to like encourage some of these institutions to kind of foster more of an anti-racist curriculum, what would that even look like? What would they do differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think if they really want to foster anti-racist curriculum, which a lot of places are trying to do that work now, I think one, there has to be like a real serious investment. You know, there has to be like a real, again, deep reckoning with history, like within your own institution, like within your practices and whatnot, like what's going on in your hospital associated with medical school, like what can we do to really deconstruct that and debase that? You know, I think there has to be, again, like an investment of funds, right? Like, you know, I think a lot of like the books I mentioned before were not, some of them were not written by physicians, right? Like medical apartheid, fatal invention was not, they were not written by like MDs or any really healthcare practitioners, right? They're written by like social scientists and things like that. So I think, you know, medicine has to really kind of be more, you know, open to like allowing those ideas to enter the medical space and medical education arena and really kind of teach us. There's a lot of great people who do that work. You know, like in my public health education, I feel like I've learned so much from great people like, you know, Dr. Bob Fullylove here at Columbia and Dr. Regine Deacqua here at Columbia, who are not MDs, right? And they have taught me so much about, you know, like racism in medicine and like how we can really like wrestle with that and change some of those things, whether it's policy, research and things like that. So I think that kind of is where it needs to start, is really kind of taking a very humble approach and saying, hey, like I'm ready to kind of like throw everything away and bring in some new ideas and really kind of take that radical stance. You know, I think so many people like fear the word radical because they think radical means like troublemaker or someone that's going to like cause problems. But to me, radical means someone that's just like brave enough to, you know, do something that's for the betterment of society and all people. And I think when medical institutions are ready to do that, they can go really far.
Yeah. Taiwo, is it possible for you to drop some of those titles of those books that you had recommended into the chat for?
Well, we could get them after, and when we send out the link, we could send it. That way Taiwo doesn't can focus on what he wants to talk about.
Yeah. And I really think that, you know, we need to just be so much more critical in our thinking, all the stuff that we're learning and taking in, you know, and just, you know, like you said, like doing the research yourself. You can't expect someone to do it for you because they're going to, you know, try to uphold kind of the status quo. And if you want to know more, you're going to have to do the work yourself, which is, you know, kind of what we're hoping everyone is going to want to do, to really unearth the truth.
Definitely. And it's all there. Right? Like it's a lot of this stuff has been written for years and years and years. I mean, again, like the whole concept of like, you know, racism versus race being a social determinant is such an old, it's a really old argument, you know, back in the early 1900s, right? Again, when eugenics was very pervasive, like post-Reconstruction in America, you know, there was a statistician, Frederick Hoffman, who was kind of saying, you know, as Black people who were kind of post-Reconstruction were really ill and, you know, they didn't have the resources to kind of remain healthy. He was attributing their, you know, kind of demise to them being Black, them being weaker, which is, again, contrary to what, you know, early thoughts about Black people were, where people thought Black people were, you know, these like beasts and whatnot. So then now there's this shift, right? And it's not really wanting to reckon with that, you know, the reason why Black people are struggling after Reconstruction from a health standpoint is lack of resources, social inequity, right? And W.E.B. Du Bois actually wrote a really brilliant piece, like countering that argument, you know, and talking about how like, it's not because Black people are Black that they're ill, it's because social inequity and the situations that we have placed them in, right? And like that argument's still going on today for a lot of people. I think, you know, at least more openly, people are starting to really be able to say racism is a public health crisis. It's just a matter of like now kind of putting that like idea into real practice, which is where we're kind of losing our footing on. But I think, you know, with pushing, we can really get there.
Yeah, I think on the subject of being a public health crisis, I don't know, Lynn, if you can go back to the slide about COVID, just wanting to kind of put that in context, because some of what you hear is that, you know, Black people are disproportionately being affected because they don't take care of themselves. And so maybe if, this was from the CDC today. Lynn, do you have the slide though that shows what the percentage was for Black people?
Was there?
You're on mute.
There was a slide for that.
If not, I know those numbers as well,
Yeah.
so I can speak to it.
Okay, if we'll let Taiwo speak to that.
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing I want to say is, you know, we are like very much in a like pandemic, and you know, I think contrary to what, you know, this current administration is kind of espousing and the supporters of that administration believe, you know, we're very much in a raging pandemic, right? And we're in a second wave. You know, we recently eclipsed over 10 million confirmed cases. You know, we're rapidly approaching 250,000 people who've died from this. You know, and right now we're kind of seeing over like the last few days, like every single day we're breaking records in terms of new diagnoses of COVID-19, right? Over 120, like for 5 days straight, if not longer. You know, test positivity rates are going up nationally. You know, the numbers are not really going away. So, you know, I think, you know, we can think about what this nation and what our leadership has done to fail us, but we could also think about like, why did they choose to fail us, right? And kind of thinking about like which populations were the most affected by COVID-19, right? And again, kind of like the disposability of certain bodies in America, right? And we figured out very quickly that, you know, it was Black people and people of color and Indigenous people who were the ones kind of suffering from COVID-19. You know, that's when conversations about reopening and like screw masks and things like that were really starting to pick up here in America, right? You know, you can't help but wonder if it was another way around, right? Let's say like white people were the one being affected the most by COVID-19. I think, you know, leadership would have looked at COVID-19 very, very differently. And I don't think that's a bold statement to make. You know, some of the numbers that you can see, right? You know, with regard to cases, you know, Indigenous people, Black people, and people of Latin descent are 3 times more likely to have to be positive for COVID-19 than a white person, right? The hospitalization rates are about 5 times higher for each of these demographics as well. And then when you look at deaths, you know, Black people are 2 times more likely to die from COVID-19 than their white counterparts. You can also look at, and when you adjust for, you know, per population, like the rate in which Black people are dying from COVID is exceptionally high, higher than anyone else in the country. And, you know, these are real things. And they, again, they don't speak to some kind of deficiency about what being Black means. It speaks to a history and a legacy of racism in healthcare, you know, all the disparities, all the comorbidities that we see that lead to, you know, increased mortality and morbidity with COVID-19. Those are direct link to, you know, different institutional injustices towards people of color. You know, you think about like stressors, and you think about access to lack of access to really good food, poor housing, environmental injustices, these things that very much link to, you know, like having high blood pressure, having diabetes, having high cholesterol, and all these things that make COVID really bad. Those are always disproportionately affecting people of color. And it's, again, just where are we putting our resources? Who are the people who are impoverished in this country? Why are they impoverished? Not because, you know, they decided to not try to make money. It's because there's a history of things that prevented them from generating wealth for their families and having and owning land and being able to have jobs that pay them a living wage and things of that nature. So, you know, it's really unfortunate. And again, this is, you know, I think COVID has kind of laid to bear literally every inequity in America. It's exacerbated it so much and has made it something that I don't think anyone could really deny. You know, the scary part is that people are no longer even trying to deny, they're just kind of looking past it. So you got to see.
Yeah. Jeez.
Do you want to talk a little bit about weathering and toxic stress? I mean, I think all that sort of underscores what you're talking about with COVID and the condition health-wise that Black people are in. But I don't know that everybody understands really what is the physical, the mental, effect of being subjected to racism.
Yeah.
I mean, definitely. I think, a lot of people kind of think of stress and trauma as these like relatively benign things that they happen once, and then once it's done, like you go about your life and there's no like long-term lasting effect. But that could not be more false, right? These things have incredible effects on people, particularly, and they kind of affect everyone throughout the course of their life, right? Young people, elderly people, even people who are in utero, right? Like there's studies that talk about the stressors of like pregnancy, and like, if a mother's experienced stress, like that stress leads to like increase like cortisol, which is like a stress hormone that could affect different things. Like, there's conversations about like telomeres, which are these protective proteins on DNA, and they really like kind of regenerate through an enzyme called telomerase. And not to get too like technical and scientific, but cortisol kind of prevents that enzyme from helping it regenerate. So like these babies who kind of experience stress like in utero are born with like shorter telomeres, right? And then those telomeres like lead to biologic aging and whatnot. With regard to like the cortisol, in a young person in the developing brain, like the different kinds of toxic stress will like affect the ability of their brain in different parts that like function with like reasoning, executive function, emotional regulation. Like the brain is like constantly, especially early in age, making different neural connections, and like cortisol actually prevents those connections from occurring. It erodes it, it gets rid of them. So it kind of causes a perfect setup for people to really have like tough cognitive abilities to like really reason, to regulate their emotions. You see like, difficulty with mental health issues for this reason. And getting to the physical health too, increased cortisol, increased stress results in like high blood pressure, obesity, high cholesterol, high blood sugar, and all these really kind of awful things. And, when we talk about stress, racism is a huge stress, right? The trauma of racism is a huge stress. Again, we talk about little kids, and there's something called the ACEs, so adverse child experiences. And, when you look at the numbers for those, those wildly disproportionately occur in communities of color, particularly Black kids. ACEs, things that count as ACEs, just to name some, experiencing food insecurity, housing insecurity, separation or divorce of parents, seeing a parent or guardian killed or die, seeing a parent or guardian serve time in jail, seeing physical violence or being a victim of physical violence. These are things that are ACEs that cause stress. These are the things that kind of cause that prolonged stress response that, has all the bad health effects that I mentioned before. When you look at the numbers in America too, looking at children who have no ACEs, right? So like white children in America, 60% have no adverse childhood experiences. When you look at that same number for Black kids, it's 39%, right? So, over 60% of Black kids are experiencing ACEs to some degree. And when you look at specific ACEs as well, like the numbers are staggering, right? Like the rate in which it's occurring in these communities is super high, and it's not because of these communities, because kind of the way society has been structured to really prevent these people from being able to have things that they need. We look at policing in America and how it disproportionately targets communities of color. You look at the legacy of policing, which kind of comes from slave patrols, and how that just got adapted into policing to protect who and protect and serve who. You remove these things, you remove parents from kids' lives, loved ones from kids' lives, brothers, sisters, family, friends, grandparents from kids' lives. Like that's having an effect on them that, is not going to set them up for success. And it's not a result of, what the kid did, right? The kid was born into the situations they were born into, right? So like, we really have to kind of wrestle with these things. And, we talk about racism and public health crisis, like really everything that kind of affects society has serious effects on mental health and physical health and health in general.
Yeah, I just want to try to bring it into terms that people who aren't minorities, who don't understand what the day-to-day wearing down of racism is, and how it shows up in people's lives, just so as people are thinking about this information, just understanding that, you know, if you're, say, for example, a black man, a young black man, you go places and people greet you with hostility, or you conceive fear on them when they encounter you, and all black people, where you're questioned about why you're someplace, do you belong there, are you qualified, where you know that you're not being treated the same as other people.
Microaggressions.
Which we don't really even like the term. We like racial abuse because we don't think there's anything micro about it, but just day in and day out of being questioned, being you know, followed, being scrutinized, being
humanized,
and also the seeing people who look like you and your loved ones being murdered on the street in broad daylight with people with a video camera. All of that is trauma and racism in action that you're constantly processing and dealing with, and you're telling us now about the results. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's on your smartphone, right? You just have access to all these things that, you know, like literally on your phone, you're seeing someone that looks like you, your brother, your father, your mother, you know, have these terrible things happen. Like, how does that, you know, make you feel? You know, people of color know people who experience these things, right? Sometimes have people directly in their lives that have undergone these terrible injustices, right? And like that kind of stress is very serious. You know, I've talked to so many kids in different settings in healthcare who've experienced so many traumatic things that they haven't really been able to unpack or like kind of free themselves of or liberate themselves of, and like that causes like stress that they hold on to. It affects the way that they move in society, and you know, it's one of those things that people really don't understand and talk about enough, right? Because these things affect healthcare and they affect people's day-to-day lives in a real way.
Sorry. Can we talk about how, you know, what does racism in healthcare look like today? And, you know, one example that Lynn and I are familiar with is, you know, wanting to be able to find a doctor who sees you, who sees us, you know, and feeling like I have a doctor that trusts me, that I can trust, that I can go to and say I have a problem, and they don't just dismiss me, but they see me the same way they would see, you know, another person who's not Black.
Right, and who's not going to have those generalizations of, oh, Black people don't feel pain as much, so I don't need to give them any medication, you know, and just, oh, they've got thicker skin, so, you know, they can deal with this.
Yeah, I mean, like all those things are, you know, very, very relevant. You know, racism in medicine it runs deep. You know, like we talk a little bit about the history and, you know, how there is like kind of a lack of reckoning of that anti-Black history that exists today. And because we haven't really addressed and resolved those things, like those issues are still persistent today, right? Like J. Marion Sims doing surgery on Black women without anesthesia because there was a belief that Black women didn't have pain is very much a reason why we see the disparities in, you know, pregnancy and different gynecological things, and just in general with Black people in America, right? Like Black people post-operatively are not being prescribed pain medication because they don't believe that, you know, they're experiencing pain, they don't believe their pain, right? You know, you look at people who have sickle cell, who have terrible, terrible pain crises, and, you know, these patients are kind of being deemed as like, you know, pain medication seekers and things like that, and not really addressing or understanding their pain. You know, these ideas are not new ideas. They are ideas that have existed for centuries that have kind of carried on because, you know, medicine's institution has never taken the time to really say like, why do we think the way that we do? Why do we have the outcomes that we have? Like, what is the history here? And like, what can we do to kind of unearth that history and like uproot those things? You know, again, the numbers are rampant. You know, Dorothy Roberts talks a lot about, and there's a lot of people who've done a lot of advocacy around this particular thing called the glomerular filtration rate, which is like a number that is used to represent kidney function. And, you know, that number is automatically elevated for Black people there's not even really a reason for it other than like the idea that Black people have like increased muscle mass. So therefore, you know, their kidney function is just supposed to be kind of better. And you think, oh, well, better kidney function. So that's great. But the reason why it's so troublesome is that number then kind of gets applied to different calculators that kind of determine kidney function. So people who have like chronic kidney disease or end stage kidney disease, like that GFR that I mentioned, plays into that number, right? So let's say that there's two people who are equal in their age, their weight, you know, their comorbidities, but one happens to be Black, one happens to be white, you know, their kidney function is going to be deemed differently just because of that. So now Black people who have, you know, chronic kidney disease or have end-stage kidney disease, because their number is deemed higher, are not going to they're not going to get the specialist care for their kidney problems. They need a kidney transplant that will save their life. They're not going to get it because their kidney numbers are better. Their numbers are too good for them to be eligible for a transplant. So that'll go preferentially towards white people who have, you know, lower kidney function based on the social construct that is race, right? Like these things are kind of deep within medicine. You know, again, we talked about COVID and like what we see with COVID is a reflection of that, right? You know, this idea that, you know, because you're Black, you are just like different, you have different healthcare things, like you being Black is a biological determinant of your ability to receive care, or like how your disease manifests is just really a myth, and it's been debunked several times. End of the day, it's really comes down to like racism that's existed in healthcare. You know, healthcare's institution, when it was originally situated, was kind of designed to serve, you know, cisgendered, straight white men, and anyone that deviates from those identities will always have, you know, worse outcomes. And, you know, with those worse outcomes as well, you know, medicine today has become more inclusive of other identities, but it still hasn't really scrubbed out its like history, right? And because of that, disparities will always exist, no matter how inclusive you make it. And until we really address that history, we can't really have an equitable healthcare system that's really going to help people, and all people, particularly Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color.
You're on mute, Lynn.
No, I keep muting myself because of my dogs, but it just makes me also think, Taiwo, about just how difficult it is to get health insurance, and how, unfortunately, it's a racist practice that it's tied to your job. You have to have a career in order to have good health care. And a lot of Black people, you know, may not be able to get health care just for that reason. And I just think that's ridiculous. They need to figure out a way to make it more accessible for everybody. If it's, you know, it should be a human right that you should just have access to healthcare and not have it be tied to your career, your employer.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, you know, since at least the time of like FDR in the 30s, right? Like healthcare has like kind of constantly been like a national issue in America, where, you know, the expansion of it or like making it universal has been discussed over and over again, because everywhere else in the world seems to have kind of gotten on board with that idea, except America, right? And, you know, a lot of that kind of comes down to what we've done here in America is we've really kind of allowed the private sector to kind of just take over everything. Things that are human rights become privatized, right? Become privatized. If someone has more money or more resources, they will always have better access to that, right? So, you know, when FDR was trying to talk about universal healthcare, and not to say that FDR is a perfect person, but he was trying to talk about universal healthcare, you know, lots of people were really against it, particularly doctors actually, who kind of wanted more control over how much they can make money-wise. And they didn't want like kind of a nationalized healthcare system that kind of set prices and whatnot, because they wanted to make as much money as possible, right? Private health insurance started to come into play as well. You know, they tied health insurance into employment, which, you know, increased access to a lot of people. But at the same time, to kind of have your healthcare tied to your employment is really problematic, because when we know that employment opportunities are inequitable, who's not gonna have health insurance in America, right? People who are impoverished and people of color. So, you know, there really has to be a reckoning with kind of saying that what are we going to do to make healthcare more available and accessible to all people? You know, I'm personally a big proponent of Medicare for all for that reason. And I know Medicare for all doesn't, it's not going to solve racism in medicine, but I think it's a fantastic first start. And once we kind of commit to that kind of move, you can then start to reckon with, other things that are going on in medicine. When we kind of, take away the idea that we need to maximize profit instead of and putting profit over people, when we get rid of that idea, we can really start to have like a love-centered and people-centered healthcare system, which is so needed.
Definitely. Well, I wonder, we have about 10 minutes left. I would love to keep talking to you and asking you questions, but I wonder if we should see if any of the participants have any questions.
There are a few questions. Let's see. Travis asks, can you think of any issues in healthcare today that we will look back on in 100 years and scoff at, like we do with the image of Dr. J. Marion Sims?
Yeah, I mean, I think, hopefully there's things that we can look at, because there's definitely a lot of things that we have, currently identified as problematic that we're still doing, right? Like, I think one of the things that's really, really tough for me is that there's like so much research, and I think research is really important because it tells a story and it provides data. But there's so much research about the disparities that exist in healthcare, right? Like, and sometimes I see these studies and I'm like, well, I could have like guessed that without even studying it, right? So it's like, now let's like really try to operationalize this research and do something about it, and I think like, specifically things that we'll look at that will be like, wow, I can't believe that we were doing that. There's just so much that comes to mind, right? I mean, I think about, I'm trying to be a psychiatrist, right? And psychiatry as a field is like a pretty progressive space of people who really kind of care about social justice and these issues. Like within the field of psychiatry, there's still so many problematic things with regards to diagnosing people with mental health issues that with their incorrect ones, right? When we look at schizophrenia, we're diagnosing like Black people who have depression or bipolar with schizophrenia, and those treatments are completely different, right? Schizophrenia is an antipsychotic, bipolar and depression are treated with different things such as like antidepressives and like SSRIs. So completely different treatments. So now you have someone that's being diagnosed with schizophrenia. Everyone believes they have schizophrenia. Their schizophrenia is not getting better with the antipsychotics. You keep throwing different ones at them. You're like, wow, they have refractory schizophrenia. But it's like, no, they don't have schizophrenia. They have depression, they have bipolar disorder. Like, we need to treat it the right way. And like, I think when these numbers, like, kind of when we look back, we'll be like, wow, we were really doing things like very backwards and we were really hurting people. And I think as we, continue to allow, more people into the field of medicine who care about these things, we'll really be able to kind of hopefully change that. And it's happening slowly, but it's definitely happening.
Yeah, and hopefully we can change some of the policing of people that have, medical concerns that aren't really a threat to the population, that they can actually get the help that they need and not just be thrown in jail or killed.
Yeah, just to kind of that real quickly too. In New York City, actually next year, they're going to, in some areas, assign like mental health experts to calls that seem like mental health crises. So that's like a really great first step. And again, a sign of like all the activism that occurred this summer, because we saw so many people, and like there were people that were like dying, in like Rochester and Philadelphia, people who had mental health crises that were getting police, be the first responders, leading to their death, right? So like that's going to be a really big component. Like it'll be nice to kind of see how that plays out, and I expect it to be good because it'll save lives and give people the treatment they need.
Yeah, give them the help they need.
Here's a question that actually goes to sort of, solutions, thinking about things we can do. It says, I work in an area that is racist at its roots, correctional health, and trying to incorporate anti-racism into the education for the healthcare staff here. What are your thoughts on incorporating anti-racism into this type of environment?
I think anti-racism has to be incorporated everywhere, right? And it's particularly in correctional facilities, right? Because in those facilities, there's a vast overrepresentation of certain people, particularly Black people, right? And people of color. And a lot of the people there, a lot of them have mental health issues that are being unresolved, right? there's a lot of kind of ideas about what these people are. What is their aggression? Is their aggression because they are an aggressive person, or is it because they have untreated mania, right? And it's like, we need to kind of do some of that work to really scrub that out. I think incorporating anti-racist education is very, very important. But I think even more important than education is kind of operationalizing that into policy and practices that exist in that place, because, we see time and time and again, like these, like, implicit bias trainings, and like, now they're calling them anti-racist trainings, and those are very important. But, beyond that, we have to really kind of really wrestle with the policy here, because, I think in America, we kind of have this tendency to look at individuals and call them bad actors or bad apples. And if we kind of focus on individuals, we won't actually really address the problem, because really what's occurring is you're having, people, whether they're good or bad, just carry out the mission of like a racist like system, right? So if you really want to kind of rid that system of racism, you have to like kind of make the system anti-racist by policy and practice. Education is definitely important though, but working with like leadership in these spaces to kind of think about like how can we like change our practices, that even if we have like a racist like correctional officer, like they can't even actually act their racism because their policies and their practices and their job title is literally not allowing that to occur. So that's like the deeper next step for sure.
Do you have thoughts, just because we're also running, we've got 6 minutes left, I'm just wondering about other suggestions you have for, that actions regular people can take in respect to the healthcare they're receiving. What other things we, the American people, can do and can be out there doing to try to make this better.
Right. Hold institutions accountable.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, again, holding institutions accountable, like you said, Lynn. I think it's, and for like regular people trying to like get as equitable care as possible, I think, kind of taking some agency and asking your doctors the right questions, I think it's really hard. I have family members who have undergone health things, and I've been able to like hop on the phone with them and in their appointment and like ask the questions that they may have been too afraid to ask. And I know not everyone has that, but never feeling like any kind of research you do beforehand is silly. I think like in medical school, sometimes we kind of scoff when the patient brings in a list of questions, but I actually appreciate that, because I think that means my patient really is taking some like agency and like trying to understand, and like there's just so many things where like a patient brings something up that gets missed. And if you, or a patient doesn't bring it up because they might feel afraid that, their physician doesn't have time for it, but like really kind of take that agency. I think, more than that, because that's hard work and it's in and of itself, really kind of supporting and advocating for, different policy changes as well. Again, like all the things that exist that are going on in healthcare, going on in America, really just kind of tie into healthcare. Environmental injustice, policing in the carceral state, all these things really factor into the health of this nation. And if we don't begin to kind of wrestle with those different determinants, we're really going to have a hard time. So, I think any kind of anti-racist work that you're doing, whether it's within healthcare or outside of healthcare, is actually contributing to a better healthcare system.
Yeah, I think like you're saying, like becoming a critical thinker, and also, really just kind of stepping into your power so that you can be a player in shaping your democracy. And I feel like we all have this power, and we need to just step into it and really start thinking critically about this and engage in this process of democracy.
So we have another question. Do you think education or widespread community training could lead to easier access to healthcare, like neighborhood networks?
That's a really good question, and I'm glad that was brought up, because I think, one thing I kind of failed to mention today was like the importance of the community, and how so often the community is kind of left out of decision making, and they're not within the room. I actually just yesterday had a lecture from a psychiatrist who was talking about some of the work that he's been doing to kind of empower communities to provide like care. And I think that's the kind of work that we really, really need to do, because I don't think, like, we always kind of have this idea of like cultural and like structural competency and say that, oh, we know what's best for this community, like we know what to do for them without even including them, right? So I think kind of giving communities that kind of agency. There's like a lot of physicians who are doing that kind of work and that research to really empower communities in a lot of ways to provide care for themselves in some ways. And it's not to say that the institution of medicine is not trying to do that, but there are a lot of things that communities can do if given the proper agency and resources. So I think, that's like paramount to any kind of work, right? So many medical institutions are in communities of color. Like the one that I go to is in a community of color, like in meetings, like in rooms, and seldom are these people in the community in these rooms as well. And we're always like yelling, like, please include them, because we are treating them. Like, how are we going to treat them without knowing what their needs are? So I think, the aspect of the community is super important. Good question.
Yeah, I think it can be certainly very paternalistic and not always know what someone actually needs, but what you think they need and what you think they should have. We've got 2 minutes left. Is there, I feel like we covered all of the questions. Let's see, is there any last words you want to say, Taiwo? Is there anything that we didn't cover that you were really wanting to say tonight?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I want to say is, listen to and protect Black women. I think so much of the things that I read and learn about are from Black women. Recently I've read a book called All About Love by Bell Hooks, and Bell Hooks is amazing. She talks so much about the love ethic and how if policy was informed by love ethic, it would really kind of create a space of really equitable care and equitable society. So really, 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 I think it's important for us to kind of, approach things with love. And like, love is not just like romantic love and like, sliding to DMs, things like that. Like, love is really kind of about like just caring for each other as people. And I think that starts again by really wrestling with our history and like understanding if you're anti-racist, right, or claim to be one, that you probably have done problematic things and probably still do and have problematic beliefs. And that doesn't necessarily mean that, your work is no longer valid. It just means that you have to kind of do the work to scrub that out of yourself. And when we wrestle with that and like understand that, we then realize that we are all people who want the same thing. And we can really begin to love each other and kind of do things for each other as a community, as a people. So, I think definitely do that. Listen to people, listen to Black women, listen to Black people, listen to people who are marginalized. These issues are not, in isolation or in silos or intersectional. We think about like issues related to, transgender people. We think about issues related to like sexism, issues related to, ability and disability and all these things. That we really have to think about these broadly and be okay with calling ourselves radical, right? Embrace the radical tradition that Cedric Robinson always talks about, right? And he writes about. And we can really make a lot of great strides if we do that.
That's beautiful. And I don't think we can say anything that's better than that. Love, kindness, compassion, empathy, and brave, and courageous. It takes bravery and courage to do these hard things. But yes, so thank you. We just want to tell you we've got some upcoming events. Check us out on our website, the antiracist.table.com. We're gonna, when we send out the link, we'll send the books a link for the books that Taiwo mentioned today. And we just want to thank you for taking your time on this Thursday evening to join us. And a very special thank you to our guest, Taiwo Alonge. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Lynn, you're muted. You're still muted. Still muted. She can't unmute. Okay.
Okay, I can unmute. I'm sorry. Yes, thank you so much, Taiwo. This has been awesome, and good luck with all of your the next semester of school.
Yes.
And graduation and everything. You're going to be an amazing doctor. We're really proud of you. We just love having this time to be able to get to know you and talk to you and hear all of your words of wisdom. You're teaching us all so much.
Yes. Thank you.
Appreciate the work that you guys are doing. It's so amazing. I'm so thankful to have been here and have this opportunity. So I hope I did you guys justice.
You totally did. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And you can come back when you're, whenever you want.
Yes, exactly.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. Have a great night, and we'll hopefully see you again at one of our conversations. Take care.
Bye.